Anything about last week? All right, so last week we covered Belshazzar's feast, which was the story of what we hear the writing on the wall. And we talked about how Belshazzar wasn't the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but more or less the fourth in line after him. And even though it says Nebuchadnezzar was his father, that just meant it was his ancestor. He was a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. And he didn't remember any of what was going on. And at this point in time, Daniel would have been in his late 40s to early 50s. So, we talk about how, age comes into play and how sometimes people, as they get older, they think that they shift away from certain obligations and services and stuff like that. But what we're going to realize there is last week, they saw this writing on the wall. So they were in a dark room, probably just slightly larger than this, maybe twice as big at most as this sanctuary. There was 1,000 men in there, or 1,000 people. There were the nobles of the land, the wives of the nobles, all of Belshazzar's wives and his concubines were all in this room together having this giant feast. And we talked about the caveat of a leader should never be compromised in front of his subordinates. So we talked about how if you're in the military, you never see an officer drinking with enlisted men because he's never supposed to be mentally compromised so that they can make fun of him if he does something bad. He should never do anything that makes him look lesser than what they have built him up to be. So here's Belshazzar, which is a king, and he's getting drunk with all of the nobles. And anytime we've ever seen this in history, in movies, whatever it is, it never turns out good. That king or whomever the leader is always does something really dumb, which happens when you're drinking, and it makes him look less than who they thought he was. And that was the case here. So Belshazzar is having this big party to tell everybody how important he was. And he said, hey, why are we drinking out of clay and ceramic goblets? Let's get the gold out of what came out of the Jewish temple. So they went, they gathered up all of the goblets and all the things that were coming out of the Jewish temple, and they started drinking wine out of them. Well, as they were drinking wine, it said a hand appeared and started writing into the plaster wall. And that was a big conversation that we had last week. What kind of hand was it? Do y'all remember some of the conversation that we had on that? Was it a big hand? Was it a little hand? I know Miss Anna and Brother Rick weren't here last week, but we talked about it. So you're in a dimly lit room, slightly bigger than this. 1,000 people is in it. Almost everybody in there is drunk by now. Just slightly some torches. They're lighting this up because this is at nighttime. And a hand appears and starts writing in a wall. Now the feast was happening as the city was being attacked by another king, trying to conquer the land. But he was so sure that there was nothing that could happen to him that he was throwing a feast. So they're in a dark room, 1,000 people, they're all drunk. He's so arrogant. Why would he suddenly become scared of a hand writing on a wall? So, Chris, Miss Anna, Brother Rick, what kind of hand could you imagine this being that would suddenly scare this guy who's so arrogant to throw a party in the midst of an attack as he's drunk? Throw some ideas at me. What do y'all think? When you envision the writing on the wall, what do you envision this hand being? Just the hand, right? Is it a small hand? Man-sized hand? Or do you imagine it being really big? I mean, there's no wrong answer. Just what do you picture?
I would think it's possibly just a normal size hand, but it's probably brilliant.
Shiny, glowing, yeah.
And writing on it so it stands out with nothing else in the background. No body to go with it.
Right. Okay. Well, Right. Well, I get that, yeah. What do you think, Miss Anna? Chris, you got anything to add to it? Right. Well, that's the point. So they're in a very dark room, and this scared him. And so I mentioned the fact that this is a really arrogant guy who thought he was invulnerable. Nothing could hurt him. And he's in a dark room, and this hand appears, and he becomes scared. So much so that his knees are shaking, and I think it says he even wets himself. So in my mind, and again, there's no wrong answer, no right answer, because we don't know this. In my mind, I think it couldn't be just a normal man's hand. Even if it was glowing, in my mind, I mean, we were all young once, right? We were all invulnerable at some point once. And in my mind, as arrogant as I was when I was a kid, and I told the story about the fire truck this morning, if a normal hand just appeared, if I was drunk, I'd want to fight that thing. I wouldn't be scared of it. So in my mind, for someone that arrogant, it would have to be something phenomenal. Very large, very ostentatious. And so, we talked about, it probably was like the hand that carved the tablets in front of Moses with fire, with lightning. I can imagine just this big explosive situation. And again, I'm not saying that's right, but in my mind, as someone who's been there, been that arrogant, been that, nothing can ever hurt me, for that to scare me, it would have to be something impressive. Because I just don't think some little man-sized hand writing on a wall would scare me. Right now, y'all have seen me with things flying around me. I'm not going to wet myself with something like that, okay? So for something to scare someone that bad, it would have to be something impressive. So anyway, this is just my way of getting y'all to think about, in your mind, what have you always pictured versus what do you think now that we've kind of elaborated on that. And then, did I ever ask you last week, Brother Tommy, what do you think it was? Yeah, that's right. Yes, sir. Let me get there. So, chapter 5, verse 24. Yep. Then the hand was sent from him out of this inscription and was written out. At very first, it does say the fingers, but then at some point it does say something about the hand. Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely, yeah. In my opinion, that would just have to be something impressive. Yeah. 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 You're in a dark room. So I like to figure out what in the world would have scared this king. He was that arrogant. What would have scared him to that point? Most of that alcohol left him through the bladder. But then we went on, and no one in the room could interpret what the words were written. But even if they could, the words didn't have the meaning. It had to come from God. So God had to interpret it. And it meant, hey, you've had your time here, and you thought you were better than God, so the writing's on the wall, your kingdom's going to end. And surely that very night he died. It says, in verse 30, that same night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Now again, that was when Daniel was in his late 40s, early 50s. So in verse 6, yeah, so it says in Darius, So in verse 6, verse 1, it says, "It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom." And these were kind of like mayors, right? So they would be governors over small areas, and that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and that over them 3 commissioners, which would be kind of like what we would consider governors of states. Okay, so they would divide the kingdom into 3 parts, and each one of those 3 parts would have one person over them, which would be the commissioner, what we would call a governor, and underneath them they would have 40 each mayors to guard and oversee the areas. And it says, "Of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss." Because obviously one man can't govern effectively an entire kingdom and know the crops and know all of the crimes and know all this other stuff, so he needs help. So this is how he broke it up, which sounds awfully familiar to our current state of government, right? And then in verse 3, "Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him." So this, and we find this over and over again in the Bible, that God kind of picks somebody, really blesses the fire out of them, and it makes everyone around them jealous, right? And these people around them either kill them or they try to sabotage them. That happens today though, right? It happens today that when you serve God and God blesses you, it makes those around you jealous. So they tried to find evidence of him, but they found no flaws in him. They found no way that he was misusing his position. He wasn't embezzling money. He wasn't forging any numbers. He wasn't trying to make himself look good. He was legitimately doing his job, but he was doing it so well that it made everybody else look bad. And then in verse 5 it says, "Then these men said, 'We will not find any ground of accusation against him or against this Daniel, unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God.'" So they knew that there were certain rituals that Daniel must abide by to appease God Almighty. And they said the only way we're ever going to get rid of Daniel is to trap him, according to making sure that he either stops what he does for his God, or that we can trap him with the rituals in order to sabotage him. And that's the only way. We can only find anything against him with regard to the law of his God. Now, we'll get there. I wanted to say something, but we'll get there here in a minute. So in verse 6 it says, "Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows, 'King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom,'" which isn't true, because Daniel was a commissioner and he wasn't with them. So it couldn't have been all the commissioners of the kingdom. "The prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors, have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the law of Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction." So these people came to him, and they said, "Hey, you know what would be a really good idea? What I think would be really good is if we make you look like God. So what we want to do is we want you to feel special, and we want to honor you, so we want you to tell everybody in the kingdom that they can't worship any god but you. So for 30 days, we want the entire nation of the Medes and Persians to only worship you as king. And this guy was like, well, sure, that sounds great. Why wouldn't I want everybody to worship me? I am great. I am really good. This is a great idea. Man, I'm glad you thought of this. You know? So these people now look good for making him feel good. And, you know, sometimes we do that with the people we work with, our friends with, you know. Hey, you know how wonderful you are? Man, I'm just so thankful that you're in my life and all that you do. And, you know, it makes them feel good. So that's what they were doing here. But there was a reason for it all. And in verse 10 it says, now Daniel knew that the document was signed. And he entered his house, and mine has some parentheses there, and it says, now in his roof chamber he had windows open towards Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. So here's what I was going to say, and I waited to say it till now. How many of us in our daily life would continuously, publicly acknowledge God to our own detriment? Because we live in a world that is incredibly divided, where morals, let alone religion, just morals will get you ostracized, shut down, canceled, hated, just for having morals, let alone being a Christian. So how many people, you know, we're looking at here who would go, you know what, now there's a law that says I'm going to be killed or tortured just for doing publicly what my God wants me to do. Just praying. How many Christians do you think would go into public places and say a prayer knowing that it could cost them their life? I think most Christians would clam up. I think very few Christians would sit in restaurants and bless their food. You know, I mean, when the world is turning to the point to where it is, if the government were to say, you know what? Anyone who's seen publicly praying is going to get cast into prison now, because that's offensive to those who aren't religious. We're that close. I mean, as is, we're getting there. How many other people do you think, how many people that you know would literally sit in a restaurant and bless their food if that was the law? I imagine you would see a lot less than there is right now. The reality is very few do it now. We're going to be honest, very few do it now. But I think it's so sweet when I see a young couple or an older couple and they reach across the table and they hold hands and they're blessing that food. I think that's just the sweetest thing in the world. But do you think that kind of stuff would continue if a law like this existed? Just to pray, not to go out and preach the gospel, not to do it, just to pray? Do you think people would continue? I think people would start clamming up awfully quick. We would choose to have our own safety. We would choose to have our own comfort zones. We would choose to keep the status that we have rather than being obedient to God. But Daniel said, you know what? Not only am I going to keep doing it, I could do it with the windows closed. He could have done it with the windows closed and nobody would have known. But he went to his rooftop where everybody could see, made sure all the windows were open, all the curtains were drawn, and then he bowed down and said his prayers, knowing that people were going to see him, knowing that there was a law that was going to cost him possibly his life. And he did it anyway. And I feel like that is repeated with what the book of Revelations and the book of Daniel is all about, and so many others, where you're going to be persecuted. You're going to be tortured. You're going to be made fun of. You're going to be ostracized. You're going to be made, all this bad stuff's going to happen to you. But do it anyway. Do it anyway, knowing that God is going to be there for you. God is going to provide for you. God has better rewards for you. Just know it's coming. Be prepared for it. but do it anyway. So this is something that's repeated all throughout, and that's why Christians, people of faith, should take such comfort in this. And this is one of those where we should take comfort in the fact that even though there's laws and societal demands and dictates and the worry of being hated or canceled or made fun of or whatever it is, that we should still do what is right because God's going to be there for us. So all of this took place. So he was in his rooftop, and it says that he continued to kneel on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God. Now, does anybody notice anything about that statement right there? Does any of that sound familiar? What was he doing? He was praying and what? He was giving thanks. Does that sound familiar? Could have been some preacher was preaching about that this morning. Right? So even back then, it was a way to make a sacrifice to God. You were offering up your praise to Him. So see, that's not a new concept. That's just something that modern day Christians have put under the rug because we just don't see it as important anymore. We can't look professional. We can't look good and praise God.